chapter 7, verses 20 through 50. Verses 20 through 29. In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them, as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and judge over us? Wilt thou kill me, as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Media, where he begat 2 sons. Burkitt notes, from the history of Abraham and Joseph, St. Stephen descends to that of Moses, where we have observable 1. The birth and education of Moses. He was born and hid 3 months in his father's house, and then being cast out, was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, and has a noble education given to him, being instructed in all kinds of good literature, to fit him for such great services as a prince's court might probably have brought him to. Moses was learned. Hence note that the greater men are, the greater their care should be for the learned and religious education of their children, because nothing is more incongruous and unsuitable than greatness of estate and meanness of understanding. It's a shame to great men to breed up their children sensually, to gaming, sporting, and excess, as if an inheritance did serve no other purpose but to make the heirs of it useless and good for nothing. Again note the latitude and extent of Moses' learning. He was learned in all the learnings of the Egyptians. Where remark 1, the different end which God had in his providence from what Pharaoh's daughter had in her particular care. She intended, by the education of Moses, the good of Egypt, but God intended the good of Israel. She designed the service of Pharaoh, but God designed Moses to be a deliverer from Pharaoh. Thus the wise and holy providence of God useth the diligence of men to effect and bring things about which they never thought of. We may remark how that Moses, the great prophet, whom God spake to mouth, is here commended for his learning, yea, for Egyptian learning. Hence we may gather that human learning is a noble and beneficial gift of God, and a very great ornament and honor unto the greatest and most excellent men. For it is in itself an ornament and perfection to the mind. It renders men the more useful and serviceable in their generation, and a greater blessing to human society, but especially to the Church of God. Human learning, indeed, is far inferior to holiness, but in holy men, learning is a rare ornament and accession to holiness. Sanctified wit beautifies religion. Sanctified reason defends it. Sanctified power protects it. Sanctified elocution persuades others to the love of it. So that to decry the use of human learning must proceed either from ignorance or malice, and a desire to have religion betrayed. Let us see that we get our learning seasoned with holiness, that we use it with humility, moderation, and sobriety, as a handmaid unto Christ, not vaingloriously unto ostentation, not proudly with contempt of others, not heretically in defense of error, never suffering human learning, but divine revelation to determine articles of faith. Then, if with Moses we be learned in all the learning of the philosophers, the more glory we shall bring to God, and be the more useful and beneficial to mankind. Observe, too, as the education of Moses in Pharaoh's court, so the time of his continuing there, namely, till he was 40 years old, after which God put into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and offer himself to be a deliverer to them. And he supposes that they would have understood the purpose of God to save them by his hand. But they understood it not. But what reason was there for the Israelites to suppose that Moses was the person designed by God for their deliverer? Answer, very great reason. Because 1, they knew that the time of their deliverance was now drawn very near. 2, from the extraordinariness of Moses' preservation, by his being hid 3 months in his father's house without discovery, by his floating upon the waters in an ark of bulrushes without danger when an infant. They might have rationally thought that such a person was designed by God for very great purposes. 3. From his readiness to defend them at this time, when an Israelite and an Egyptian contended. For it was wonderful that so great a person as Moses was, and might have been, should concern himself in a private quarrel betwixt two obscure persons. Moses might well suppose that his brethren would have understood how that God, by his hand, would have delivered them, but they understood it not. Observe 3. The ill treatment given to Moses when he offered himself to be a reconciler. They thrust him away from them, and expostulated with him, Who made thee a ruler or a judge? The meek man replies, Sir, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? Where note 1. Who were the persons doing wrong to each other? They were Israelites, both Israelites. To see an Israelite and an Egyptian struggle had been no wonder, but to see two Israelites who were brethren, brethren by nation, brethren by religion, brethren in tribulation, both the seeds of Abraham, both initiated into the same covenant, both in bondage to a cruel tyrant, Pharaoh, who had condemned them to an ignominious slavery and designed such a degree of cruelty as to murder all their male issue. This was an astonishing sight, and Moses might well say, Why do ye wrong one to another? Plainly implying that both parties were to blame, but that party most who would not hear of a reconciliation or putting a stop to the quarrel. A reconciler is more odious than a stranger, in the apprehension of some. Observe lastly how Moses, being thus ill-treated by them, departs from them, and they hear no more of him for 40 years. Verse 29. Then fled Moses, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where, observe, the years of Moses' life were 120. 40 years he spent at the court in Egypt, 40 years he spent in Midian with his father-in-law, Jethro, and the last 40 years of his life in the wilderness. Now all this time, Moses was a worshipper of the true God, and that in an acceptable manner, and most of his time he worshipped God without either tabernacle or temple, from whence St. Stephen draws his argument to prove that as God was acceptably worshipped by holy men before either tabernacle or temple were erected, in like manner he may be so again, after both tabernacle and temple are destroyed, and consequently that they unjustly accuse him of blasphemy or speaking blasphemous words against Moses and against God. Verses 30 through 50. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord, in a flame of fire, in a bush. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the afflictions of my people which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and I am come down to deliver them. And now come down, I will send thee into Egypt. This Moses, whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out. After that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God rise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, who received the lively oracles to give unto us, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, and in their hearts turned back again into Egypt, saying unto Aaron, Make us gods to go before us. For as for this Moses which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we want not what is become of him. And they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifice unto the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of the god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them. and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, as he had appointed, speaking unto Moses that he should make in according to the fashion that he had seen, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus into the possession of the Gentiles, whom God drave out before the face of our fathers unto the days of David, who found favor before God and desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house. Howbeit the Most High dwelled not in temples made with hands, as said the prophet, Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hands made all these things? Burkitt notes, St. Stephen here goes on with the history of Moses, and having in the former verses made mention of what occurred to him in Egypt and in Midian, here an account is given of what happened to him in the wilderness. And the first thing observable is the appearance of God to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, which burned but was not consumed. This bush was an emblem of the church. The bush burning pointed out the afflicted state of the church in Egypt, having a long time been in a fiery furnace there. But the burning bush, not consumed, signifies the church's preservation. God was in the midst of the bush, while the bush was in the midst of the burning. Where note how Almighty God, intending to send Moses as a deliverer to his people out of Egypt, gives him a visible sign for confirming of his faith in the sight of this burning but unconsumed bush. 1. To assure him of his people's deliverance, that though they were now slaves in Egypt, yet they should be set free and instated in a land flowing with milk and honey. Next, to satisfy him that he should be the instrument to bring to pass so glorious a work. Oh, how gracious is God's condescension towards his servants, who is pleased by visible signs to support the weakness of their faith. The Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire in the bush. Observe, too, how Moses, in the faith of God's presence with him, protection over him, and assistance of him, goes forth for Egypt, where he works many signs and wonders before Pharaoh. At last brings the people forth into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where God gave them his law and appointed Moses to make a tabernacle for his worship. Now the use which St. Stephen makes of this is to convince the Jews that for above 400 years their fathers had worshipped God without any tabernacle at all, and consequently that now the sect of worship was abolished. God might be very acceptably served in worship in the absence of it. Observe 3, that notwithstanding Moses was raised up by God and sent to be a deliverer into Egypt and a lawgiver to the Israelites in the wilderness, yet they rebelled against him and against God in him, for they ran into the vilest idolatry, even to make and worship a golden calf, to adore the host of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars for deities. Yea, they carried about with them the images and pictures of the heathen gods, Mars and Saturn, with the design to worship them, for which gross idolatry God sent them into captivity beyond Babylon. Hence learn, 1, that there is a strange inclination in man's heart to the sin of idolatry. The reason is because it's a worship of our own invention. Now man is most fond of and forward for that service of God which is of his own finding out and setting up. We love a devotion of our own devising very dearly. Learn, too, that idolatry and worshipping the sun, moon, and stars is a very ancient sin. Both the old Gentiles and the old Jews were guilty of it, and consequently may infer that neither antiquity nor universality will bear us out in idolatrous worship. Example is no plea against a rule, nor antiquity against truth. There is no excuse to us, when we do evil, to say our forefathers did so before us. Learn 3, that the idolatry of the Jews was a grand iniquity, and much worse than the idolatry of the heathens. The Gentiles knew not God, but the Jews owned him and gloried in him. But though they knew God, they worshipped him not as God. Observe 4, the Israelites, being come out of Egypt by the conduct of Moses, and having entered into the wilderness at God's appointment and particular direction, the tabernacle for his public worship and service is erected. That is here called, verse 44, the tabernacle of witness. It being the place where God used to witness and manifest his glorious presence, and because the ark of the covenant, the law, and the testimonies were laid up in it, which were witnesses and declarations of God's will, how he would be served. Now this tabernacle was an ambulatory temple, as the temple was a standing tabernacle. The tabernacle was movable. They carried it with them from place to place, while they sojourned in the wilderness, and at last they brought it with them into Canaan, verse 45, which tabernacle our forefathers brought in with Jesus, that is, Joshua, into the possession of the Gentiles, that is, the land of Canaan, where it continued all the days of David, till Solomon began his reign, who built the temple in a most magnificent and sumptuous manner. Note here, 1, that the public worship of Almighty God is a moral duty founded on the light of nature and the common reason of mankind. 2, that solemn places for public worship have been from the beginning, before the giving of the law. The ancient devotion of the world delighted much in groves. Genesis 21:33. Abraham planted a grove and called there on the name of the Lord. This was a sort of oratory or chapel, whither Abraham and his family resorted to worship the true God. After the giving of the law, while the people of the Jews were in an unsettled condition, God was contented with a mean tabernacle. But when they were settled in Canaan, then a magnificent temple is built, in some measure suitable to the greatness and majesty of that God whom was to be worshipped in it. From whence we may infer that the public worship of God, though it doth require inward and spiritual devotion, yet as public is necessarily external, and as such it ought to express in the best manner we are able that profound reverence which we pay to the divine majesty. And therefore the circumstances of it should not only be decent, but very solemn and magnificent, the light of nature seems plainly to require, and the gospel doth nowhere gainsay. When David determined to build God a house for public worship, he resolved it should be exceedingly magnificent, which resolution was not a piece of ceremonial piety, but grounded on a moral and eternal reason, of equal force in all ages, namely, that the greatest and best of beings, being most awfully adored by us in the best manner we are able, and that we declare our high regard and esteem of so glorious a majesty by all outward fitting testimonies of respect and reverence. Observe lastly, that after the temple was built, the worship of God was not so tied to that place, as that he could not be worshipped acceptably anywhere else. For God hath declared by the mouth of his holy prophet, Isaiah 66:1-2, that he delighted not in the temples made with hands, as if he were included therein and bound thereto. And thus St. Stephen, by a large induction of particulars, made good his defense, that he was not guilty of blasphemy for affirming that Christ would destroy the temple and change the customs which Moses delivered. He closes his apology with this argument: that which was not blasphemy to affirm of the tabernacle, though it was set up by God's special appointment given to Moses, is not blasphemy to affirm of the temple. But it was no blasphemy to affirm the use of the tabernacle to have been temporary and consequently alterable. Therefore, to affirm the same of the temple is not blasphemy, especially since the Lord hath said that he dwelleth not in temples made with hands.